So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you're joining us from. So welcome everyone who's joining us from Facebook as well as on Click Meeting. We have today our first panel for the virtual summit on resilient and regenerative food systems. We focus on addressing climate risk, food security in the face of COVID-19 and beyond. So we have three speakers to speak with us today, and I will open the floor for a brief introduction. So Sandra, if you could introduce yourself and tell what you do.
Sure. A very good afternoon and greetings from Amsterdam to everyone. Greetings from Europe. I am an architect. I have been working on food systems and cities since 2004. So it's sort of my lifelong passion, and I'm delighted to be able to reconnect with you today. My day job right now is a collaboration on bioregional collaboration with the Middle East and around 22 countries. And I also work on regional bio-collaboration here in the Netherlands and in Europe. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Sandra. So I'll take Dennis and Marcelo next. Dennis, if you could.
Yes, of course. Thank you very much, Vositha. Hello, everybody. My name is Dennis Mombauer, and I work as Director of Research and Education for SLYCAN Trust, which means I'm also based in Sri Lanka, where also COVID cases are a bit spiking again. And I coordinate the research work of SLYCAN Trust across the different thematic areas and projects, many of which relate to food systems and climate risk. And more about that when I present later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dennis. Marcelo, over to you now.
Hello, everyone. My name is Marcelo Cunha. I work for the UNFCCC Secretariat here in Bonn. And yes, I'm very much passionate about regenerative food systems. At the Secretariat, I'm the focal point for an initiative called Resilience Frontiers Pathway, the Pathway on Regenerative Food. We are very much in line with this session. And prior to that, I worked for UNCCD and also for the World Agroforestry Center in the Amazon, and where I also did my PhD on how food systems can contribute to reconciling biodiversity conservation and livelihoods. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it's great that you brought up Resilience Frontiers, because we connected with Sandra through Resilience Frontiers as well. And most of us are working as part of the work that Resilience Frontiers does on different themes. So it all connects together, the themes, the pathways, the word that you use, pathways. I'm Vositha Wijenayake. I forgot that I didn't introduce myself. So I'm Vositha Wijenayake, and I'm also from SLYCAN Trust. We're based in Sri Lanka, working in Asia and Africa on different themes related to climate change, sustainable development, social justice, and conservation and ecosystem restoration. So now let's go to our first presenter. Dennis will be speaking first. Dennis, the floor is yours, and we shall switch on our videos. So switch off.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much again. All right, so I want to talk about how to manage climate and disaster risk to food systems. And so we, as mentioned, we have a number of projects that relate to this. We have one project specifically on climate risk and climate risk transfer mechanisms in Sri Lanka at the moment. 2.5-year project that is focused on the agriculture sector. And then we work with a number of countries in Africa as well on adaptation and climate resilience. We have worked with Tanzania and Uganda and Niger, and are expanding this work now to 4 more countries, Malawi, Mozambique, Chad, and Myanmar. So I want to talk about food systems. And I think, first of all, it's important to note that food systems doesn't just mean food security, especially in developing countries. Food systems, food production is closely connected to livelihoods, Large parts of the population in these countries we work in lives in the rural sector, and most of their livelihoods depend on food production, on agriculture, on livestock sector, on fisheries. So it's important for food security, nutritional security, all that. It's important for livelihoods and income, and it's also can be an engine of rural development. And there's a lot of different aspects of it. It's quite complex. So I said agriculture, livestock, and fisheries. These would be like usually the three main examples, but of course there are also things like forestry. And there's not just the farmers themselves. There's a whole net on system of supply and value chains attached to this. That goes from the people supplying the seeds and fertilizer to the ones transporting the harvest, storage facilities, traders, food companies, value addition, and then of course the markets, the retailers and consumers. And in addition to that, there are also a number of, like I would say, maybe support systems. There are financial providers of loans and insurance, information providers, weather forecasts, early warning systems, climate information services. There are extension services that provide technical knowledge and support to farmers, and then of course the whole rural infrastructure, technical and information training. And then a number of related sectors, for example, health sector is quite related, education, social protection systems are important. The whole environmental aspect is there. If you listen to our keynote speaker, Professor Ratan Lal, he, I think, said everything almost that there was to say about regenerative practices when it comes to soil management and water management. It's important to look at the agricultural system as an agricultural ecosystem as well. And then, of course, risk management, which I will talk about in a moment a bit more. And all of this is embedded into an enabling environment. So that means national policies and processes, it means laws and regulations, but it also means things like the social-cultural background, like traditions, like cultural aspects to this. In all of these countries, agriculture is like closely tied to social cultural factors as well. And of course, then international processes as well. Climate-related ones, the NDCs, the Paris Agreement, national adaptation plans, things like a Sendai framework when it comes to risk reduction. And of course, food systems are relevant to all of the SDGs, especially to the ones like to 1, 2, and the one about consumption, production. But really, all of them are relevant to food systems in some way or another. So I have listed here some of the vulnerabilities that food systems have in these different aspects. And these are mostly taken from the Sri Lankan example, but they apply more or less to all of the countries we work in. So I think you all know risk would be composed of like a hazard, climate impact, then exposure to this hazard, and vulnerability, which has different elements like sensitivity and coping and adaptive capacity. And these are some examples of vulnerabilities, some main examples of vulnerabilities of food systems. So, for example, in developing countries, usually the majority of agricultural operators and also fishermen and livestock farmers are smallholder farmers. Large parts of this is rain-fed, so very reliant on predictable weather patterns and on reliable weather patterns. Also, the same goes for livestock and farm animals. And due to like low degree of mechanization, low degree of technical knowledge and equipment when it comes to regenerative agricultural practices, conservation agriculture, climate smart agriculture, and also a significant amount of informal labor. There are a lot of like inefficiencies, a lot of complexities, a lot of lacks of capacity that create vulnerabilities that make the whole food system more vulnerable to climate impacts. And these are compounded by other risks. So food systems are inherently a bit risky because they have this reliance on weather, and they also have reliance on like market information and market systems. There needs to be a market to sell the food that's being produced, and this is often uncertain because there's a lack of information flow, because prices fluctuate, because there are no fixed prices, and because farmers don't know what the market wants. and then there are mismatches between what is being produced and what is being demanded by the market. So I won't go into detail on all of these, and I won't go into detail on all of these either. That would be some of the climate hazards and impacts. In Sri Lanka, all of these basically are there to some degree. So the crop cultivation sector would be affected by temperature increase, changes in the rainfall patterns, water scarcity, and then of course extreme weather events, including floods, droughts, storms, and the slow onset impacts like saline intrusion, decreasing soil quality, and then increasing incidence of pests and diseases. And livestock suffers from heat stress, from droughts, floods, and then also from secondary impacts. There might be reduced yield of feed crops, reduced availability of pasture, waterlogging, new disease risks, and also changing in the growing seasons of forage crops. And fisheries, of course, are also exposed to extreme weather events, to changes in the ocean ecosystem, to changes in coastal and marine ecosystems. And also inland fisheries in Sri Lanka, there are a lot of water tanks, and there's tank fisheries, and they are impacted by drought as well and water scarcity. I will very quickly go into one case study, the Sri Lankan example. We have an ongoing research focused on 2 districts, Anuradhapura and Trincomalee, marked on the map there, where we interview farmers and survey their knowledge of climate change and the impact they have. So all of them report very high impacts on climate change. 92% in both districts report high temperatures and heat waves. 88% report changes in rainfall patterns and pests and diseases, and 81% water scarcity and drought. So these are all, almost all the farmers are impacted by climate change. And this is very much the same in the other countries we work in as well. And they report a number of issues and challenges. Most of them are related to the climate impacts themselves. For example, then secondary impacts like human-wildlife conflict when there's water scarcity, and the decrease in yields due to soil degradation and the high salinity levels, invasive grass species, and then, as mentioned before, the market risks that are there, and also the lack of risk management systems or risk transfer systems. And some of the farmers are trying to adapt to these impacts, to this climate risk, with different practices. Many seek better early warning information from government providers, and some try to plant improved or more resistant crop varieties, to shift their planting and harvest cycles, or to find new harvest or planting methods. But as we can see here, all of them, the highest we have is 55%. That's better early warning information. But most of them are below or around 1/3 of farmers who are trying this. So there's a lot of room, I think, to do more on this front, and to find more and better ways to deal with the climate risks. And when it comes to risk, there's also, of course, the question of risk ownership. Is it the farmers themselves who have to own that risk and account for it, or is it the government who should provide risk management? Or is it farmer societies? Is it agribusinesses? Is it other parts of the supply chain? And there are a lot of different examples. If you listen to our interviews last week on Friday, Dr. Punjavardhana made a nice example of the big onion cultivation. I would encourage you to listen to that. It shows a good example of climate risk that the farmers are unwilling to bear and then abandoning this kind of cultivation in response. And yeah, so there are a number of potential risk management strategies. So the first step would always be to have actually risk awareness, and then understanding of the risk and assessment of the risks. And then we can try to reduce and prevent risks, and have systems like social protection systems, and also other compensation mechanisms. But there's always an amount of risk that's remaining, and that can be covered by risk transfer mechanisms and climate insurance. And then that what's remaining from there can be covered by risk retention. There are a number of also traditional and informal risk management strategies that people employ. That includes, for example, livelihood diversification, For example, having a cow would be a kind of risk management strategy. So there's not entirely reliance on the rain-fed crop cultivation, but there's a livestock element to it as well. Another possible adaptation strategy is migration. That would be like basically diversifying the livelihoods across, like translocally across an area. So part of the income comes from the city and part of the income comes from the field. But that brings a number of problems with it also, to social cohesion, to health, to the community. So risk transfer mechanisms, very briefly, would mostly be what we look at is insurance. And there are a number of insurance schemes. In Sri Lanka, for example, there's a government-run insurance that covers, at least on paper, every farmer in the country that cultivates a certain, like 6 specific crops. And this can help farmers to bounce back from impacts from climate shocks. But it cannot be like a comprehensive one-size-fits-all strategy. So on the left side, it shows like a graphic that includes insurance, market insurance and government insurance, but also embeds it in a network of different other kinds of risk management or risk finance in this case. Adaptive social protection, government reserve funds, that would be risk retention, financial inclusion, where the farmers are empowered to carry risk themselves, to have savings and to get access to like low interest loan schemes, and all the revenue diversification, so having not a complete reliance on agriculture. And if all of these things are not in place, that means that people resort to ad hoc coping strategies, which often results in the loss of vital assets, in their employment, their livelihoods, and also takes away money from development activities. It can push people into poverty, and it puts additional pressure on public resources. So the thing to do to protect food systems especially, but in general to have comprehensive risk management, is to have a holistic understanding of the food system itself, its different aspects, from the supply chain to the supporting sectors to the production itself, and then have a comprehensive risk management strategy that includes risk prevention and risk reduction, but also risk transfer and risk retention, and adaptation measures that address inefficiencies and productivity issues, that give farmers more ability to manage their own risk, and a better technical understanding of climate-smart agriculture, regenerative agricultural practices. So, in conclusion, moving away from managing disasters and shocks to managing risk, and to be proactive about this, to have an anti-risk finance, and to manage risk in a way that is holistic and comprehensive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dennis, for the presentation. A lot of information about the work that's happening with farmers related to food security and addressing climate and disaster risks. Now we have Marcelo who will be speaking to you. Marcelo, if you could switch on the camera and the mic, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Vositha, and I will upload a couple of slides that I prepared. And in the meantime, I'll just say that Dr. Youssef Nassef has delivered a keynote. He is the adaptation director at the UNFCCC Secretariat, and he's also the head of the Resilience Frontiers Initiative. So he has very eloquently talked about the vision for Resilience Frontiers. So I won't go into that. Also, he talked about the processes under the Climate Change Convention. So I will focus on exploring, as the PowerPoint shows here, leverage points for resilient and regenerative food systems. I hope you can see it. Okay, so going into the food systems, climate change, and COVID-19 challenges as the topic of this panel has COVID-19 and extreme weather events threaten both food security, but also livelihood security of agricultural value chain actors. So particularly upstream actors, meaning especially smaller scale producers and also fishermen and women are particularly affected. So there is an unbalanced distribution of costs and benefits among the food chain actors, which is reinforced by both the climate change and COVID-19 impacts on food systems. So Dennis already talked about risk and risk ownership and details on the research. So just to give you a couple of highlights of what I mean by unbalanced distribution of costs and benefits within food systems. For example, already existing asymmetric market structures can turn into monopolies in the food sector. So there are buyers, particularly small and medium enterprises that have gone bankrupt and now exacerbate the dependency from the suppliers on a few buyers. And that is also leading to monopolies. So there is unbalanced power distribution there as well. And the accessibility and access to food is limited by drought, by flood, and also COVID-induced trade restrictions. Food supply shortages and food insecurity are further worsened by COVID. So the food supply of agricultural products from particularly smaller scale producers have been affected. For example, in the Amazon, where not only has there been drought, extended and more severe droughts, there has been an exacerbation by COVID that leads to shortages in supply and also food insecurity of, for example, indigenous peoples there. So talking further about the challenges, the challenge I would like to highlight here is that along commodity chains, global agricultural value chains tend to entail high pandemic and also climate risks, as well as potential negative environmental impacts for different reasons, but also deforestation and greenhouse gas emissions. So, for example, soybean production taking place in the so-called global south, and the consumption mainly taking place elsewhere, and particularly of cattle, not even humans consuming soybeans, is a challenge in terms of telecoupling effects. So also transnational land use and the linkages between the consumption and production in different places. I could list more examples, but since we're advanced in time, I'm happy to go further into those if questions come later. And now moving to the second and last part of my presentation, I'd like to highlight the solution pathways, if you will. So ways that can help us to get to mainstreaming regenerative food systems. So talking about the enabling environment, it was mentioned previously, briefly by Dennis, and here just to highlight 6 enablers for sustainable food systems that are regenerative, restorative, So first of all, scaling up good practices like permaculture, like agroforestry systems, diversified systems, and support for climate resilient and nature positive food production, like these mentioned systems. Building capacities based on national and subnational, particularly needs, including of women and other vulnerable groups. So there are studies that have shown that women, when they map their plot or the land they use, they include the small gardens that they use, for example, to cook, or they include the production sites of food, and compared to men that even have forgotten to map that when they were asked to. So this shows the important role of women, and going into incentivizing, which is the third point, incentivizing sustainable collective food production and marketing through cooperatives, as well as environmentally and socially sound demand for agricultural products is key. So there have been recent developments now in Europe, but also elsewhere, where there are tax breaks for farmers that produce sustainably, and also subsidies are now starting to be more conditioned by sustainable practices for food production. Subsidies to farmers, for example, in the EU, it just came out yesterday in the news, but also in other regions. So further, fourth point, shifting from land degrading and water draining food systems to deforestation-free and climate compatible food production. So a production scheme that adds to nature rather than subtracting from it. Fifth, more inclusive governance of food systems, and also credit systems to overcome the asymmetries we talked about between producers and few buyers, or even monopolies. So there's a lot of room for improvement in the governance of food systems, which are mainly driven by lead firms, and could be more participatory, while strengthening upstream nodes of food chains, namely smaller scale producers that are responsible still for 70% of the food we eat. Sixth point is transforming public procurement and scaling out and scaling up school feeding programs to foster resilient and regenerative food systems. There are cases of school feeding programs, for example, in African countries, also in South America, that could be scaled out. For example, 30% of the food purchased for consumption at schools in a country in South America, Brazil, there is to be sourced from smaller scale producers, family farmers that produce sustainably. So there are many positive examples, but there's still a long way to go. And I would just like to finalize by saying that we cannot, and by we, I mean indigenous peoples as well. So we can learn a lot from them. And so we cannot achieve resilience for all without regenerating the climate, the health of the planet, and also of peoples. And last but not least, regenerating food systems. So that's what I wanted to share with you. And I'm happy to further answer any questions later on. Thank you.
We have one more presentation before we go into the question and answer session. Sandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for having me again, and I'm very pleased that my colleague mentioned Dr. Joseph Nassef's presentation early on this week, and Dr. Nassef spoke about symptoms. And as we all know, the COVID-19 and climate change are indeed the symptoms. So the world is a different place right now. The world we knew before COVID-19 will never come back. And it is an opportunity to replace ideas that failed us with a new Build Back Better green recovery ideas. And it is a balancing act to find out what functioned before and what is needed now to prosper in the new normal. And before we enter into a discourse on how technology will help us, and in inverted commas, to save the world, I would really like to explore connections between food and place, and think about aspects of a long-term resilience in connection to geography. And for a very short moment, I'm going to take you in a journey through time, and if I may, in terms of what has functioned before, and present you with two maps. These are some of my favorite maps. They come from a fascinating book by Professor Chris Scarry called The Human Past, World Prehistory in the Development of Human Societies. And what you could see here on this map is effectively human colonization of the world from around 250,000 years ago until a year 1000 BC. And I think it's really fascinating to see where we have come from and aspects of migration at the time. The second map shows the origin and spread of agriculture. And there are two things that I think are important for our discourse today. One is the type of agriculture and food that was historically produced, connected to geography, to different ecosystems and climatic conditions, and we have wheat, rice, maize, etc. But the second one is to do with time. The advent of agriculture is dated for around 9000 BC in the northern parts of the Middle East, the Levant countries. So theoretically, it means that for around 241,000 years, we were nomadic. And the advent of agriculture meant that we became settled. The advent of agriculture also gave birth to cities. Across the world, in different climate zones, cities and agriculture would coexist as a self-sustainable unit. And we know that from archaeological findings that cities and agricultural area could coexist in self-sufficient way for around 5,000 years until the advent of globalization. And very often we speak about COVID-19 and the food production in terms of some horrifying statistics that are actually quite real. But I really wanted to also highlight the fact that food is really connected to cultures, to our culture, whether it's a material culture, culture of cooking, culture of eating, and my colleague mentioned the indigenous cultures. So I think it has a lot to do in kind of repositioning our story of food and how we could think about new scenarios for food production today. And the lack of food and unsustainable lifestyles in history wipe out the entire civilizations, as brilliantly portrayed in The Collapse by Jared Diamond. I think that the problem of food has started with treating it as a commodity. So globalization on one hand alleviated poverty, and on another disassociated food from its place of origin. Today, in some countries, 80% of food is supplied not from neighborhood country, but actually from another continent altogether, which brings me to a discussion about symptoms that we have previously quoted and highlighted by Dr. Nassef. We all know that these symptoms and work hard, yourselves, all of you in the panel are working day and night probably to address them. But I think I wanted to bring one particular symptom in connection to food production, which is a land degradation UNCCD probably is a good source for statistics about it, but that is a fundamental issue, because some countries, for example, United Arab Emirates, have only 1% of arable land. So desert countries, we talk about, for example, North Africa, some of them have very little productive land, and this is a huge issue, also a security issue, I would say. And then the other symptom is COVID-19 that we are unfortunately enduring, and we know that there are many more viruses like COVID-19 up there exposed by deforestation, degradation of ecosystems, particularly in the rainforest climates. So for that reason, I think that the food security issue in the Build Back Better story and the long-term resilience needs to realign the food with geography and its place. So food and place really matters. COVID-19 exemplify pre-existing conditions, and one of them is crisis of globalization. Many see solutions in regionalization. The success of free trade areas such as the European Union, and in Asia, the Association of Southeastern Nations, are demonstrating that the world is moving into regional solution. Moreover, with the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, the aspect of regionalization is not only in free trade agreements, but in bioregions, that is, regions that share similar ecological and climatic characteristics. The post-COVID-19 world is overwhelmingly local, at least on paper and in speeches, but in reality, redirecting food systems to a local food supply chain is really difficult and time-consuming. We are in a position, at least in Europe, fortunate in arable land, whereby global food supply chains are more efficient than local food supply chains. And it is more expensive for a farmer to supply local food and more expensive for a customer to buy local food as well. Although I really would like to mention European Green Deal and farm-to-fork strategies, I think that Europe is a place to watch in terms of regional approaches to food security and sustainable resilience food systems, and with a mission of leaving no one behind. But I also wanted to mention in the context of food and place, urban-rural linkages and urban-rural self-sufficiency that today is non-existent. And this is something that international community and multilateral agreements speak or have spoken since 1992 and the Agenda 21. So for almost 30 years, we have been debating how to integrate rural and urban areas better. And I have to mention work carried out by my friends in UN Habitat. And I think there is a huge scope in reconnecting global policies, global recommendations on the topic with local solutions, and as well as post-COVID-19 scenarios. Now, I myself was really fortunate to produce rural urban dynamics policy recommendations last year for UNCCD for the Global Land Outlook, and I structured this policy around 5 capitals: natural, human, social, manufactured, and financial, because there is a huge multifaceted complexity of issues and codependencies that need to be considered to find holistic solutions on the ground. Now, COVID-19 brought also to the forefront our codependencies on technology, and without a doubt, our lockdown lives would be more miserable without technology. And no doubt, technology is bringing co-benefits for agricultural productivity. And using Resilience Frontiers language, I would say that we became Homo technicus, not really Homo sapiens. However, I think that at times positioning technology as a saving grace might lead us astray, because I think that it's really important to reposition the store of food within the nature, land, and ecosystem restorations. People that represent my profession, for example, at times think that it is better to grow food on a building than on a land, because agriculture is unsustainable. So there's a lot of capacity building on mindset where sets in general where this food needs to grow and what is good for nature and for our long-term resilience and existence. But here in particular on this image, I wanted to present you a case study which is probably extreme, as a solution for food crisis. This is 2019 personal food computer version 3.0. It has been designed by MIT Open Agriculture Initiative, and effectively this is a computer farm, a mini computer farm that is being monitored by AI and the climate, the energy use, and the plant growth. And there is even a special software called Open Agriculture Brain, which gathers this data. So in a discourse about the role of technology and how far can it go, I think we really need this balance on thinking whether we are going to head towards a personal computer spaces as a food production versus restoration of land and ecosystems. For that reason, I think that the Build Back Better strategy needs a variety of solutions. Technology, yes, but also we probably mustn't forget about nature and restoration of ecosystems. And to conclude, I do not really believe on the sole reliance on technological solutions, as I've mentioned before. I think that bioregional solutions are probably a way forward. And I would like to quote here Mr. Guterres from 2019 Climate Action Summit, who did say that nature is angry and we fool ourselves if we think we can fool nature. So in other words, reconnecting food systems to their natural habitats is critical for our existence. And I wanted to thank you and hand you over to our moderator.
Okay, thank you, Sandra. That was thought-provoking. The images that you are sharing, it's great to see a lot of color and information in such a, I don't know, specific way that makes us think about what you're saying as well. So thank you very much. Moving on to the question and answer session, I would like to request the participants to enter your questions in the chat box, and we would project it to the main screen for our presenters. While waiting for your questions, I have a few questions which I would like to put forward as well. So I'll start with Sandra and go backwards, I think. Sandra, you mentioned that in your part of the world, since right now I'm in Sri Lanka, I can say your part of the world to Europe at the moment. So you mentioned that the local food is more expensive than the food that's brought from outside. We would think it would be the other way around. So would you like to explain a bit why this is the case?
I shared this information because I'm interested in urban-rural linkages, and I have spoken with some researchers and people affiliated with local municipalities in the Netherlands that work on the shorter food supply chains. And I did, for example, in the food productions of horticulture, which is tomatoes and others, and other vegetables, it is more efficient for a farmer to sort of sell the entire food stock to a global food supplier than do this locally. And effectively, the global food trade is very efficient. So because the type of agriculture we are producing right now, and I think it will take a long time and a lot of political goodwill, which is appearing on the horizon, to redirect these food supply chains also to the local market. Vositha, I think I lost you.
I'm good. So thank you very much. It takes a bit of time to load. So now over to Marcelo. You mentioned about the work you've done in Brazil and the indigenous knowledge that is being brought into the food sector and also the Resilience Frontiers pathways. Do you have specific examples that you would like to share? I remember you talking about a project in the area that you were doing your PhD a while back. So would you like to share a bit about how the governance structures were set in place and that sort of aspects where there would be collective action for food security with indigenous knowledge being brought in?
Thank you, Vositha. And if I may, also related to your question, just briefly mention that at the Climate Change Secretariat, I also support the local communities and indigenous peoples platform. And on your question directly, Vositha, so On the research I did, so it was more on local communities, tribal peoples, and their food systems, how their systems contribute to both reconciling biodiversity, forest conservation with their diversified livelihoods. And just to mention the one point that stands out and in terms of non-timber forest products, for example, nuts and fruits that have natural occurrence in forests, using them sustainably and eating and selling them at a given scale is a way also to conserve forests, and that I found evidence in these communities in the Amazon that in terms of avoiding other degrading land uses that cause deforestation, for example, cattle ranching, extensive and large-scale soil production. So instead of doing that, they are doing sustainable practices in terms of food systems. They are collecting, for example, Brazil nuts and selling it via cooperatives collectively to local markets, so to conserve forest and also sustain their livelihoods.
So now I want to ask a question from Dennis, but there's already a question in the question section. So I'll ask that question to from you. So it's from Ashan. He would like to ask, what are the next steps that will be taken to address issues that you have identified in the work that you mentioned?
Yes, of course, that's a good question. It depends on what your steps being taken by whom. So I can, of course, mostly speak for what SLYCAN Trust is doing, but actually the project we have in Sri Lanka, which is under the Resilience Global Partnership, is called a MAPS project, and it's focused on building multi-actor partnerships, which I think is a very important element of addressing climate risk in a holistic and comprehensive way. Because there are a lot of institutions involved in this. It's not just the Agriculture Ministry or the Finance Ministry. The ministries related to infrastructure, ministries, health ministry, education ministry, private sector entities, from agribusinesses to financial institutions to banks and insurance companies. It's CSOs, it's community organizations, it's people on the ground, the farmer societies, community groups. And I think it's very important to bring all these stakeholders and actors together and then have a kind of strategy that addresses climate risk in a more systemic way, that goes across these sectoral silos and across the climate change, sustainable development, and other processes, and combines all of these to address them. So I think that's the next step to be taken. There are many things, of course, already being done by governments, by other institutions to address climate risk in different sectors, in different areas, from climate smart agriculture projects to improving irrigation to capacity building of farmers. So I think there are a lot of options that can be done, but it's important to keep in mind that they need to connect somehow. It's not enough to just work on one aspect on it. And that's also why we are trying to have risk transfer not just as an isolated thing, but as part of a larger risk management framework. So yeah, I think multi-actor partnerships, exchange of information, exchange of best practices, and then trying to have more systemic change. And along the lines also of what Sandra was talking about, what Marcelo was talking about, and what also the keynote speakers, Dr. Nassef and Professor Lal and James Ehrlich yesterday were talking about. Thank you.
We have a few more questions that have come up. Let's see. We have one from Suramya. Maybe we can put it onto the screen. So it's a question to all speakers, and it's on the screen. You could read it as well. She would like to know, how will data and research shared with stakeholders? So how well are data and research shared with stakeholders throughout regions? And what are the challenges in making those partnerships work? So Sandra, would you like to answer this question with all the experience you have in working with different regions in the work you've been doing? And then we can go to Marcelo and then Dennis.
Thank you. I think the question has 2 points. The question of data and collection of data is so important, and we see on and on actually quite so many UN conferences the story of dependence of data and its lack. And I think that the work needs to continue with collecting data, but also even without data. And the partnerships, I really think that the global recommendations on the food supply and sustainable resilience food systems, including the connection of food systems to their neighborhood urban areas, because the world is getting a bit more urbanized. And this is really important to bring that holistic cohesion back together in terms of partnerships is there. So the global thinking in terms of how we could do that across the planet is there. I think that the partnerships needs to be now in translating these recommendations that have been accumulated for good, if not 60, definitely 30 years, translating them on a regional level. And I would build these partnerships on bioregional level, because sometimes we need economy of scale. For example, with food production, there is something called biocircular economy still to be explored, new jobs that are really desperately needed on so many regions, especially now post-COVID-19 area. And it's possible to pull this off only through the bioregional collaboration. So these bioregional partnerships probably will be very important. I believe that the knowledge is there. We just need to translate it, customize this to the local solutions, and create new policies with a political will and stakeholder engagement. Thank you.
Would you like to answer next the same question? If not, Dennis. But I'll first ask Marcelo to see whether he wants to.
I understood that I am to further complement, right, the question. So just to mention partnerships in terms of school feeding programs, for example. There was a webinar by the World Food Program on school feeding programs and how they are partnering also with suppliers of food to, even now during COVID times and during this pandemic, they are managing to supply particularly needed school pupils with food. So I think that's a very good example in terms of how to keep regenerative food systems alive and while leaving no one behind. Thank you.
And there's also another one which has come up for you. Maybe you could combine both together. So the question that's there for you is, it's focusing on youth, especially from an agricultural aspect. How can youth be incorporated into the work on resilient and regenerative food systems? Additionally, what role does COVID-19 play in this? Maybe you could link the partnerships aspect to this and combine the two questions and answer.
Okay, so that's a number of questions I tried to answer. So first of all, for the how well are data and research shared with stakeholders throughout regions. But that is, of course, I mean, a very broad question, because there are a lot of different kinds of data and research and a lot of stakeholders. Some data and research is certainly being shared, for example, even through webinars like this one. But then there, of course, for example, when it comes to risk information, there are certain restrictions, certain barriers, and there's a lack of sharing of risk analysis and risk models. While not a lack of sharing, but there are barriers to access them. For example, a lot of these sophisticated risk models are being developed in the global north, and there are legal or economic barriers to access them. Actually, the Insurance Development Forum has published a very comprehensive report, very interesting, just yesterday, on risk analytics. I encourage you to check it out. And that actually goes into detail on the difficulties with risk information and risk analysis that is being shared or not being shared, and how this is a big gap for especially developing countries to address risk in a more comprehensive way, because the governments don't have this, or the individual ministries, institutions don't have these more complex risk models. And the private sector, of course, has a lot of this, but then private-public partnerships are not, there's a lot of room to improve on this and to use expertise that the private sector has in analyzing risk and assessing risk and share that with government and from that partnership have like a much better grasp and much better way to promote risk transfer instruments and risk management strategies across a country or even across a region. And regarding the youth aspect, there's of course a lot of potential to integrate youth into this, especially in agriculture. In a lot of these regions, in Sri Lanka, for example, the young people are not too enthusiastic about getting into agriculture because it is very high risk. It demands a lot of like time and commitment. So they are trying to find different livelihoods, different jobs and income, and potentially also move away from rural areas. So I think if we want to develop rural areas and like make them more resilient, there needs to be ways to integrate youth and make it more attractive for them to stay in these areas and participate in the development of these areas rather than moving to other places. And in the field survey we did, for example, we encountered a number of youth also that are having or developing businesses, like small businesses, which can be a strategy also to diversify the economy in these regions. And the third question was about what role does COVID play in this? That's also a broad question. Actually, for the agriculture sector in Sri Lanka, the impact wasn't too bad on the agriculture sector, also agricultural producers themselves, but it laid open some flaws and some gaps in the distribution channels, in the supply chains, and how to actually link producers and markets. So COVID is one of the risks that needs to be addressed. Risk like COVID, other unforeseen risks, because no one, I mean, at least no one among the farmers was expecting a pandemic this year. I wasn't expecting one. There are people, of course, who had planned for this, but not in a way that was like comprehensively addressing this kind of risk. So COVID is one of the risks that should be addressed, but probably we need to keep in sight that climate change is there, and that there are other risk factors that we can predict quite well that we need to address. Thank you.
Everybody else who answered the questions. There is a question that is a general one about how you could connect with the work that we're doing, and with the presentations will be available on SLYCAN Trust website. Yes, all the presentations, the recordings of these discussions will be available on our webpage, which is for the summit, as well as the knowledge portal that's on our website. So you can always access this. Even this one would be available by tomorrow, most likely. So the presentations, I would request whether the presenters are okay to share them, then they'll be available. If not, the recordings will be all available for you to listen to and get more information on later on as well. So focusing on COVID, there were opportunities that were created by COVID as well. The fact that we have identified certain gaps that existed, which we haven't focused on, and how this could contribute to building forth or building towards something better post-COVID. Any examples of what you think could be these opportunities? For example, in Sri Lanka, even in the work that we're doing, like Dennis made a comment, we have noticed that there is a potential to have regional or local-based food supply chains being enhanced. so that the hotel chains could be having direct supplies from producers who are not having suppliers during in a situation like COVID. So, or else like for even like reducing the transport amounts for transportation of food, which would cut down emissions and would have a positive impact on addressing climate change risks. Could you think of any examples like that, Sandra or Marcelo, that you would like to share with us, where we could use the experiences from COVID to address food security issues in a better way in the future?
Hello, could you hear me? Because I partly lost you, Vositha.
Can you?
Yes, thank you. So maybe I just maybe I answer on two scales, if I may, on the macro scale, regional scale, and then the local scale COVID solutions. I think particularly in the Middle East, there is an opportunity now to bring back the food cultivation to the ecosystems. Historically, for example, I'm working on oasis ecosystems. We know that there was a huge food biodiversity, up to 60 species or so, that has been lost. And I think using the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration is a wonderful opportunity for post-COVID green recovery, and I think this is partly happening right now. Now, on the individual scale, how COVID-19 have helped to reorganize the food supply, and in particular food scale, I wanted to give an example from Europe, even in Amsterdam and the Netherlands, where I know that the particular bank, which was actually a Rabobank, work on redirecting food supply chain, the waste food, to poorer families that were on a very low income threshold. So the food is there, sometimes it's in the wrong place. Using technology and some political goodwill, it must be possible to redirect the food that someone doesn't need to someone that actually is in need. And I think the technology and goodwill and have helped us, and maybe that is going to be a long-term solution for some of us. Thank you.
Do you have any examples you'd like to share?
You're directing to me, right? I just missed the first part of when you talked, but I would just like to, second, really build forward better instead of building back, and that was also mentioned on Monday by Dr. Yusuf Nassif, and in the context of COVID and beyond that. And in terms of, I'd like to now just briefly touch upon, it was mentioned risk ownership, but now in terms of risk perception, I think climate risk and other risks usually are quantified in mathematical terms, and they have a formula for that, which is very good and rigorous. And at the same time, I think where there's more potential and also potential to learn from peoples at the front lines of climate change risks and also impacts themselves is really how they perceive risk and how they perceive the impacts and what solutions they already have. So I think also connecting to data to have more evidence in this domain of risk perception and impacts and solutions that are already in place in different regions by different communities addressing, responding, and avoiding climate change.
So Dennis, do you want to add anything to the answers?
No. I think I'm this was well addressed by the other two speakers.
Right. I think we're coming towards the end of the discussion, but okay, I think I've missed a question to Sandra. So Sandra, it's on the screen. What are some specific economically viable steps governments can take to redirect food supply chains to local markets? Do you have any suggestions for this?
Thank you. Considering that I am not an economist, please forgive me, I would redirect the answer to a wonderful document. It's called Farm to Fork Strategy, produced by the European Union as part of the European Green Deal. So this is for the entire European Union countries, 27 countries, if I'm not mistaken, recommendation how to do that. And it also, it looks at the economy, but it looks at society, sustainable food. And I would direct the person that wanted to ask this question to this document. Is available online, Farm to Fork, European Commission. If that's okay. Yeah, thank you.
If I could ask the moderator.
So, sorry, Dennis wants to add a bit also. Oh, Marcelo, you wanted to add to this question? Do you have anything to add?
Yes, just also, trying to respond and to the question. I think one of the impacts of COVID-19 we're seeing is the rise of food prices. Food crops were already sensitive to weather conditions, but now COVID-19 and trade disruption is further affecting food prices. And I think in terms of the effects, I think mostly they are felt by landlocked countries, by SIDS, by small island development states. So there, where the food import dependency is high, I think the COVID impacts are being felt and more, and also coupled with trade restrictions that are currently taking place.
Okay, thank you for the answers to the questions that were raised during the question and answer session. As a last question, I would like to connect the discussion around habitats, the migration discussion, and then food security, because these were elements that were brought in by the different speakers. So the question is, how do you see these addressed together? How do policies that we develop for food security can integrate climate migration, displacement, that is being discussed by different countries and different actors, and how can we have holistic responses to this? Marcelo, I think in the Resilient Frontiers, in different pathways, we speak about all these elements. Sandra has already spoken about these issues previously in different discussions. So can I pose a question to everyone? And Dennis, I'm sure you can bring some of the research that's ongoing in different countries as well.
Do you want me to answer, Vositha? Shall I just give a quick one on migrations and urban-rural migrations?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. So rural-urban migration is one of the biggest drivers of urbanization. And I think that a way to prevent that issue of rural-urban migration, which is at times quite tragic, is to effectively build resilience in peri-urban areas of cities and reconnect cities with their rural areas. There is a huge role also for secondary and intermediary cities. And that means that the sort of holistic thinking with urban-rural areas needs to be reconsidered once again. And then the story of shorter food supply chains come into play. And I think also that the geography and self-sufficiency has a lot to do with this new vision for Build Back Better future post-COVID-19. Thank you.
Marcelo or Dennis, would you like to take the next turn?
Yes, okay, I'm going to jump in. Yeah, so that's a very good point, because I think a lot of what we discuss as climate migration or climate mobilities, or in general rural urban migration, is closely connected to food systems and the functioning of food systems and the rural economy, which often revolves around food production and like the supply chain of that. So I agree with Sandra, like building resilience would be, I think, the best way to address this. In some cases, migration can be seen as an adaptive response to the climate impacts that are there. But it's usually not one that is out of choice. It's a forced response. So in Sri Lanka, for example, a lot of farmers in areas that are affected by drought and water scarcity, they go in the off seasons to the city to work there as what's called unskilled labor, as drivers or construction workers or something like that. And then they go back for a harvest season or planting season. So they have an additional income source that is not dependent on agriculture. But there are a lot of issues with that. I think I mentioned this before, also to both physical and mental health of both the migrants and their families staying behind. It's places high burdens on the families staying behind, usually women, and the elderly or special needs or children. And it greatly affects the social cohesion of the family and the communities. And we are doing research on climate migration in Sri Lanka and displacement and climate mobility and immobility, as well as now in two other countries, in Ghana and Niger. So you can actually check out some of the research we did on this. And I think it's closely connected to food systems and food production, because both food systems and migration have a lot of interconnections to different sectors, from health sector to education sector to like financial aspects, to risk management, to sustainable development, to nutrition and livelihoods, and to the different aspects of the food system. So you can find that on the first publication we have, our latest policy brief, on our knowledge hub, and more information on that from our side will come soon.
Yes, Marcelo, you can take the next.
Okay, thank you very much, Vositha. And also, we already had the challenge of climate-induced migration, and my colleague and manager Coco Warner has written extensively about that, and we have drafted text also on COVID and migrant labor impacts. So there is, of course, due to border closings in many countries, that has constrained labor mobility, impacting all the nodes of global food supplies and food chains. So at the farm level, producers have faced labor shortages for preparing fields and planting their crops, but also at the processing level, migrant and other labor shortages have affected the processing, packaging, and storage of food supplies. So COVID-19 related migration restrictions are really hitting and also expecting to further reduce remittance flows, which could impact the food security of families that are dependent on this income transfers also to purchase food. Thank you.
So a big thank you to all the speakers. We have only a few minutes left. So I would like to thank all the speakers and request if you have any closing remarks to please add now. So I'm going to mute my mic and I'm going to allow you to speak.
I just wanted to say thank you for having me, and it was a pleasure to share the stage with all of you and see you again. And I wish you all the very best. Be safe. Thank you.
If I may, oh, go ahead. I just wanted to briefly also thank you, SLYCAN, Trust, and Vositha for inviting the Secretariat, UNFCCC, to be here, and it was my great pleasure to also try to contribute to the discussions here, which were very fruitful and insightful for me as well. I learned a lot. Thank you.
Yes, I can only echo that. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Vositha and the rest of SLYCAN Trust for organizing all of this. And thank you all, Sandra and Marcelo. I learned a lot from your presentations. And also thank you to people asking questions and creating a very lively discussion. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us. Big thank you to the speakers, and that's it from us. We'll be joining again with a panel discussion. It'll be on just transition in the agriculture sector. Thank you very much. Bye for now.